All right guys, hey, welcome to Hollywood Mechanic, and today we're talking about a hidden pollution that is a big issue in cars. In the 80s, modern cars were really just coming into their stride, becoming more efficient. The EPA had set standards for lowering hydrocarbons back in the 70s, and they were meeting those goals in the 80s. And then technology like variable valve timing and gasoline injection were causing cars to become much more efficient. In 1993, the EPA established a partnership for a new generation of vehicles. And this said that cars had to triple their fuel economy and improve their safety, all while not increasing costs. It's a pretty hard standard to set for the EPA for automotive manufacturers. Improve the car drastically, but don't increase the cost. How did auto manufacturers meet those stringent standards? Well, they did it through plastics. Plastic technology had been greatly improving, and what plastics allowed is for a cheap way to make cars lighter and have less mass. And that improves all those things that the EPA needed, right? It made the cars safer because it's a lower mass to collide with other things. It made them lighter for easier fuel economy and also cheaper. How is plastic cheaper? Well, plastic melts at a much lower temperature than steel or aluminum. And so in order to mold plastic, the material that is catching that melted plastic doesn't need to be as strong as the material that's catching molten steel or aluminum. And so the process to make molds is much, much cheaper. Another thing, when metals are manufactured, that's not the end of the process. You can't just take a piece of metal that's been molded and throw it in the car. It has to be polished to smooth out the rough edges, and it has to be coated then or treated to prevent rust or oxidation. Metals like aluminum and steel oxidize over time. And with plastic, you didn't have to do that. The mold was pretty much ready to go and you just threw it in the car. And so auto manufacturers started massively introducing plastics into the car. Plastic's not a cool thing. It's in the environment. It's kind of, it's there forever, but it's not a bad idea. It really helped produce cheaper, lightweight cars. So plastics are great, but auto manufacturers started being irresponsible with their use of plastics. So, plastic door handle. That pivot breaks, and this breaks on C-classes all the time. And like if you were Jeremy Clarkson, like a really large dude in England, and you slid off of an icy bridge into a lake in the winter and frantically grabbed for this door handle and it broke, this might be your coffin. That is one example of irresponsible use of plastic, but another example is in the engine bay. Plastics have started taking over the engine bay. You're seeing plastic intakes, plastic valve covers, plastic oil filter housings, transmission pan, got the filter integrated into it, and it's all plastic. Another place in the engine bay that they're using plastics more is radiators. Coolers, oil coolers, radiators, intercoolers. They used to be all made out of aluminum pieces, but now they have plastic end caps on them, and those seals are always what fail. There used to be radiator repair shops, people who made an entire living just repairing radiators because they lasted the life of the car, but not anymore. Now, about 10 years, they always start leaking and they have to just be trashed, and they have carcinogenic coolant in them and it's just thrown in the trash. And even if you wanted to repair a radiator, good luck finding someone who can do it. The business is just dried up because plastic radiators became so prevalent. And it's not just the radiator, it's the whole cooling system. Thermostats and water pumps are increasingly using plastic impellers, plastic housings, and the worst is the hoses. All the radiator and cooling line hoses now have a plastic connector on either end. Whereas before, you could just take a rubber hose and buy a generic rubber hose, cut it, and fit it on with screw clamps. Now, you have to replace it because the plastic ends become brittle, and now you can't just replace the hose. You gotta throw away a whole assembly and buy a whole nother one. This is a problem. Unlike other plastics in the car, plastics in the engine have used gas immersed on it. Plastics are kind of absorbent, and they are taking these carcinogens from used oil and storing them. Used oil in studies has been shown to cause cancer. If it's left on the fur of animals in tests, they found that it was directly linked to cancer. So once these plastics absorb this oil that's been used, it now becomes carcinogenic and is not easily recycled. If you were to try to recycle these things, you would need a dedicated network of recycling bins and processing facilities that would collect it from cars and take it back and treat it and recycle it. And this whole process would be kind of expensive, and that's the point of plastics. It's really cheap. Manufacturers wouldn't go through this process of recycling it. They would just throw it away and make a new one because it's cheaper and more profitable. Metal parts of an engine, on the other hand, are recyclable. Every day I have trucks that drive by and stop and ask my shop, do you have anything that we can scrap? It's become a way of life for some people, is going around to shops and picking up old transmissions, valve covers, air conditioning compressors, and taking them to be recycled, because those metals can be recovered, melted down, and purged of all those carcinogenic properties, and then reused for other metals. Plastics cannot. They pretty much just go into a landfill, which means we're taking those cancerous fumes coming out the tailpipe, packaging them into a black plastic box, and then burying it in the ground, where rainwater washes those carcinogenic properties into our drinking supply and into our groundwater. And there's another big problem with using plastics in the engine. Plastics have a much lower lifespan than metal components. They say it's about 20% the life, which honestly is probably short in some cases. An engine block from the 50s can be rebuilt and still running today, 70 years later. If you were to make an engine block out of plastic, no way it would last more than 10 years. It would have to be thrown away and replaced. The same thing with valve covers and intake manifolds. We're gonna compare an intake manifold here from a Maserati and show you what the exact benefits are. Now, due to plastic's lack of strength, plastic manifolds actually have to have a lot of reinforcing design, which makes them a little bit heavier than they could be if they didn't need that reinforcement. So the weight difference between this aluminum intake manifold and this plastic intake manifold is only about 3 or 4 pounds. It's not that big of a difference. But if you look at this intake manifold, you can see the runners there. They're covered in carbon, because that happens. Carbon builds up. But on this plastic one, you can't take it apart and clean it. And on this aluminum one, you can take it apart, clean it, and restore a more efficient engine by doing this process. With the plastic one, you would just have to replace it. With the aluminum one, it can be resealed and reused for years and years. But with this plastic one, they will begin to warp and become brittle, and it must be replaced. Otherwise, it'll cause leaks and check engine lights and inefficient burning of fuel, which means, again, more pollution. Okay, so what's the bottom line here? We really need to hold automotive manufacturers responsible for the way that they're saving money. One of the ways they could do this is they could use fewer different designs of engines, because if you mass produce one valve cover, it lowers the cost of that development of those molds and makes it more affordable. Manufacturers that are just changing up valve covers on every type of car means that they're just going to plastic because it's a quick, easy way to get on a different design. We really need to stop using transmission filters in the pan, in a plastic pan. Whereas before, you could take the old metal pan off and dispose of a very small paper filter that could have the oil pressed down of it and create a very small hazardous waste. Now we've got a big transmission pan that is completely hazardous waste. We gotta get away from this.